What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another CSGO map analysis video. Doing a little something different this time. We're going to be taking a look at a map that is actually in the map core Faceit hub. So if you were planning on being competitive, you can actually check out towards the end of this video. Timestamps in the description, as well as, of course, the chapter system will take you to some nade lineups. So if you're interested in something like that, you can do so. And if you're not interested, well, you'll know exactly when they begin. So until then, we will actually walk through the map, and I'll give you some of my thoughts. This is Neutron by Single, or Married. He actually goes by both names, so quantum relationship status going on over there. This is actually a bit of an older map, of course. This is a map that was released in 2015 and last updated mid-2016. And I was quite surprised to learn that. This map actually looks pretty slick, pretty minimalist in that sense, but the assets don't look of like atrocious quality by any means. So I'm actually quite surprised that it's such an old map. Perhaps current modern mappers might be able to learn a thing or two by looking at the way that this map was arted in that respect. A lot of it obviously not necessarily custom. I do believe that a lot of the high-resolution nuke assets were used in this map from the nuke remake all the way many years back, obviously. So maybe that has something to do with it, but we will get into all of that very shortly. First, we're going to talk about the layout a little bit. Obviously, we're playing from the T side. Got my sniper man over there. So T-spawn is quite roomy, and it does initially make you think, oh, I wonder how many positions I actually have to go. It gives you plenty of space to obviously lurk back between if you had to for some reason. If the CTs get here, it can be certainly a bit of a pickle for any terrorists. Mid is very important, and it's actually deceptively so. This entrance in does pretty much mandate that you pop this window with either a knife or with a pistol every time, and this is kind of a common criticism you'll be seeing, is that you're almost always doing these very repetitive actions that don't add too much. Like on Mirage B site, maybe you can get some very minor value by getting your jump just right so that you don't have to pop that little window thing that's at the edge of the window and mark it. And then you can make it seem like, oh, nobody was even in window. Actually, nobody even went B if like a terrorist spots that, and meanwhile you're like hiding behind bench. But it's just such an odd thing. Like most rounds it gets popped. It's a little bit different with vent on Mirage now that goes into sniper's room, because obviously that's now used by the terrorists if they can self-boost in there. So that's a little bit different. But something like this, where you're going to be popping it every round you go mid, which should be every round in general, even on a pistol, seems very strange to me. I do say even on a pistol, I do think maybe you can justify going all 5 towards A on a pistol, or even potentially all 5 towards B, which we'll get into later. But this is something that I think just is a common criticism of the map. There's just too much glass that the terrorists specifically want to pop as often as possible so that they can get some utility thrown out there. And again, remember to check the end of the video for those lineups. Obviously, as we get into the rest of mid, you're going to see the CT spawn pretty quickly. This is one of those oddball maps where maybe this is a symptom of it being a little bit older, but you do have very quick contact if you actually want to go for the fight. And I kind of like that. You know, it's not something that you see too often. Kind of Dust 2-y in that sense, where both spawns are pretty close to one another in terms of lines of sight, where very quickly the CTs can get to a position to look straight at Ts. Now, obviously, it helps this map that they don't have to cross a door where they can get shot through and spammed through in order to just reach the other site. Obviously, if you want to go B from CT, you just walk over here with no threat whatsoever. In fact, the Ts have to be out quite a lot in order to even catch like a late rotate or something, which has much less value in that case. But one of the things that I will say about mid is that because of the fact that when you have mid control, it's so much easier to, essentially pincer down on either one of the connectors to either site. It's very important to have this as a T, and that means it's very important for the CTs to hold it. The CTs themselves can leverage some stuff. If the CTs get mid-control, they obviously have nice and easy access towards heaven from A, which is what you'll see up these stairs. There's a little vent there that is a little puzzling for me, to be honest, but we'll get into it a little bit later. And this is heaven looking over to the A site, which we will come back to. But it's important to understand where essentially mid sort of spreads out into. It's kind of fractal in terms of how many possibilities are there. So this is obviously the A side path from CT spawn. So this little side hall area, as the top left above the radar tells you, is essentially where you're going to be going if you're going to be going A. And this into the computer room is actually quite interesting because obviously this leads up into heaven or into a pincer towards mid. And this is where you can probably already tell there's going to be some interesting CT setups towards mid if they want to hold this. Because the longer the Ts don't contest outside over there by T main, the longer, the more likely it is that you could get wrapped around from somebody running through computer room. So you might even want to default 2 CTs towards mid every round, one of which playing maybe around these benches, maybe like behind this pillar, just sort of spotting, and he can fall back. Although I think first contact would be around here where I'm standing and then looking towards where that glass used to be that I popped earlier with my knife. So that would probably be where you'd want one CT, and then the other CT could play maybe like essentially from this position, and then he would just have to like hold maybe out here. He might even play a little bit more forward. And in this situation, this as a forward default is actually very strange. Very, very interesting stuff here. Obviously, this is like an elevated position, so I don't even know what head height would be, but it would be something like, you know, we put a guy there and we'll see what head height is if you're defaulting. So yeah, you'd be holding around here. It's like maybe a crosshairs, the average crosshair down from this little stripe, so you can use that as like a bit of a guide, or this doorknob, a little bit down from the doorknob. So whatever you want to do there. But I think it's quite interesting that we have a scenario where one of your default positions would, in my opinion anyway, likely be knifing this and then holding, at least for something like this. This is a much more passive angle than going all the way out and looking out and maybe getting shot from somebody holding as a T. But that's something that the Ts also have to keep in mind. I think one thing people will find as they play this map and adapt to the metas that may or may not show up is that, in my opinion, this would be quite a CT-sided map if the CTs treat it like Overpass, where you're constantly looking for odd angles and forward-facing positions, and your rotations are super important. So I think in that situation, you know, Overpass isn't aggressively CT-sided, but if you're a T-side that doesn't know what to do when an aggressive CT side on Overpass comes a knocking, it'll feel CT-sided, that's for sure. And I feel like if you just learn the angles a little bit by walking around the map like this or just watching this video, you should be able to, on CT side, get quite a bit done. And then hopefully with my nade lineups, you'll be able to get a lot done on the T side as well. But just this default right here, holding the computer room entrance, having one guy mid, and then you can kind of just leave one guy A and two can go B, that can be a very powerful hold, right? So that's obviously where I would suggest you allocate your 5 men. We'll take a look at the A pathway from CT spawn as well, just to finish up this site. And this is where things can get so hellish for any Ts coming in. So you have this, what's called yellow in the top left. You have obviously the back of A site under this interesting thing. You don't have to crouch under this, you just walk under it, which is very nice. And you have what I would call pit over there. And then, of course, there's like red room. Yeah, yellow and red, I guess. So you have yellow over there. That's like obviously much harder to get a line of sight out. You've got red, which is probably where I would imagine most oppers would be posted up if they're holding passive angles on A, and they'd be scoped out right down there. The other thing, too, is that A main is kind of a mess just to walk into. And not only that, but check this out. So you can actually be underneath the bridge. This callout is apparently hell. Given that we have a heaven, we might as well also have a hell, right? I expect most people with a rifle would be holding back here. There's a pretty nice Molotov I got in the lineup section for that. So you can clear that pretty easily. But the problem with this whole bridge area is that as an A defaulter, you can essentially just sit here. And because of the way that this was clipped off, or not clipped off, I guess, you can just sit on this. And then, like, unless you hard clear this and expect it as a T, a CT can just hold this, shoot, fall back, and then let, you know, their teammates do the rest if there is a second person on A. And maybe this is where you obviously wouldn't want to do that if you're a solo man A, because obviously if you're solo A and you don't have actual cover to fall back on, you can kind of make things a headache. But if you're in that position, that's really only good. You want like maybe one guy there and one guy red, and that might be your setup where the one guy takes a couple shots, hopefully gets a frag, at least gets damage and info, then falls down, sort of like Inferno A balcony, gets his nades out, throws them, and creates some cover while he's getting covered from anybody rushing to try to punish from somebody red, or maybe even somebody like who's like holding above pit or something like this and then can fall back into pit and do the same thing as the guy who was just above hell. That might work out very well. I would theory craft that would be very, very powerful as a two-man A setup, but you don't even need to do that if you have information because some guy's computer and the other guy's mid, and those two can work as a duo, retaking map control and spotting out if there is an A take. The A take can be countered in that sense by multiple different angles, which is certainly going to be a bit of a headache for any would-be teams. Now, in the locker room, which is a very large area, and obviously in the vent, which is another place that CTs can actually rotate through if they need to catch people off guard, I would say, man, the whole A side certainly feels very difficult for the Ts, doesn't it? And this is one of those situations where you obviously want to be able to execute, and that will require some nades and obviously window popping, which again, just as I said earlier, that mandates sound cues that the CTs can then react to if they want to do any utility whatsoever beyond maybe like some cute flashes you can throw through the main door. It does feel very, very challenging. So I'll show the vent a little bit. Obviously, this is the rotation. You can just jump down the ladder. Very similar to Nuke in that respect. So you can do that silently and still quite fast. I just didn't bother doing that for the sake of this video. And then that gets you out into a main, which you can then use to pretty comfortably flank anybody who might be setting up over here. What I would not be surprised in, actually, is if you expect your enemies to go for an A push, or you get scouts, some sort of scouting information that, like, maybe your mid guy actually goes forward and doesn't, or you get information that nobody's B and you just expect an A hit. If you can somehow get to vent silently, right? And you can climb down here. Well, again, silently is the key word. You could actually sit right here and wait for any nade sounds to be heard. And you hear those nades fly, and then you can just, like, pop out. This is a common nade spot where you'll be throwing nades from. That's another one, and another one to the right of that a little bit. So those are the three major spots, and those are also be where people are holding from. And you can just pop right out there, pop the vent, and then, just unload, right? So again, there's so many different things you can do on CT side. Some of them a little bit more situational. Others, I think, just almost bulletproof in theory in terms of how you would execute. And the fact that the locker room as well is so large and takes so long for the Ts to actually get to means that your A default could actually be over here as a CT. And this is almost like the ancient A site where you'd be up against the corner and you'd be sat here, and then there's like a secondary avenue over here. It's obviously much wider than the A site on ancient, but you imagine that little corridor into A. Your default as a CT might be like one sitting vent like this, and then he can scurry off and go to heaven, which is a very quick rotation for him to still support the A site, while the other guy can sit here and hold the right side. So maybe that's how you want to play it as well. There's a lot of flexibility on the CT side, and to that extent, you actually want to be able to, again, exec to take mid so that you can at least, as Ts, siphon off some of this map controls and try to maybe close the noose, so to speak. We're going to take a look at B now because I think we've talked over A pretty well. Obviously, we'll go a little bit more in depth in the nade section for those things. But you can start to see how A site in particular is quite difficult to take as a T, just because there's almost a couple of different checkpoints you would need to have in order to make sure that the CTs aren't flanking you. And it's always something you've got to have in the back of your mind if the CTs themselves are confident enough and familiar enough with the map so that they can say, all right, let's go for this push, let's go for this info, let's see what we can do. So the first thing you should take note of is this little bottom of mid CT connector. This will take you into what I would classify as B main. It's called construction in here. Maybe this could be considered B main as well. This is a shop. Very unlikely CTs get this far before the Ts do. So I think the contact point would probably be around, like, at best, you'd be sat like in front of the truck, maybe like spotting over here and spotting around this giant pillar over here in the shop. And that's probably the best case scenario for any CTs. There's a bit of I'm certainly questioning the importance or position of this long haul callout, which obviously feeds back into mid. I'm not 100% sure why it's here beyond to connect mid for rotations. It doesn't feel like it provides too much flexibility for the Ts, but one thing that you can leverage that for is that you can, if you're worried about somebody having a crossfire set up, or maybe an opper is playing like on top of the truck, peering down and holding your men from the shop, you can obviously rotate around here and then maybe throw some utility, smoke this off, even wrap around depending on what the angle is. Obviously, you are opening yourself up to a world of pain otherwise, though. And maybe another thing that you can use here is the opportunity to say, all right, what I can do as a T is I can actually use this opportunity to try to take mid control from the B bomb site side, like the B half of the map. You can see this is not as simple as like a 3-lane map, which initially is what it looks like on the surface. It feels a lot more complex. It feels like there's a lot more going on. And in fact, there are a lot of things going on. I'm just not 100% sure if all of them were essentially as well articulated as they could have been. And I think this B connector is one of them. This mid connector, we'll say. But this does, again, increase the importance of having mid control in the first place. Because as a T, it's a lot easier to exec onto the B bomb site if you have somebody that can come out from this angle. Or even if you can, like, say, smoke this off and run straight into the B-bomb site from CT spawn. You can see how the CT spawn is almost its own objective because of how impactful it can be in giving the T's control. And I like that, you know, in a way. It's certainly a different look than a lot of the maps that are currently in the pool, and certainly a different look than even a lot of the maps that are going to be in that Faceit map core hub. But these are just things that keep me thinking, that certainly keep the gears turning. I do think that there's going to be some side imbalances when people solve the map, or at least get the map to some degree of competency in terms of how they approach it. That's just something that we've all got to figure out, right? So, bearing that, being as that is the way that it is, we can talk a little bit about the B approach in more depth. I think the default for the T's would be to smoke this off, and again, I'll go over these nades a little bit later. You want to smoke this off with a bit of a running start. It's very loosey-goosey. And then if you can get yourself into a position to throw a flash off of this, I forget exactly the lineup, but I think it's... No, yeah, it's just aiming at the bottom of this windowsill. And then that's kind of like the God Flash. It'll bounce off of that, but aside from that tiny sound cue, nobody's going to notice it. You're going to be full blind. If they're very attentive, they'll obviously notice it. You can hide from it by hitting over here, in which case you might want to be in a position to throw a supportive flash through the window. Again, by setting maybe around here and then throwing on the other side. That's obviously a little bit lower, but if you can throw both of those flashes at somewhat similar timings with your T-side exec, you can pop out of that through the smoke, in fact, that you've thrown. The one concern is that obviously you have no control over here. So this is where I don't actually have 100%... yeah, I'm actually not sure what the smoke would be for that, but it certainly isn't that. I guess it would be something like this. Yeah, that would smoke off at least the connector, and that would allow you to somewhat safely, like, just check this angle. And then as you get out onto the site with the flashes, okay, you can do something. It's interesting in a way how the smokes that you would want to throw, there is, like, one that you can get directly onto the truck, but I feel like that's almost pointless because if somebody's playing behind, I guess this would be called Optimus after Overpass. If somebody's playing Optimus, then they can just walk around. So that smoke doesn't really give you too much. They can also just sit up here and then wait for the smoke to dissipate, or like play around here, in theory, with, you know, teammate support. So you can, there's going to be some mollies for those locations, barrels, and that truck area. Aside from that, your best bet, I think, is just to get onto the site with some flashes, smoke off this area so you can't get shot beforehand. You could also just flash people off that angle and peek with it, almost like you're, you know, you're flashing people off of the op angles on Inferno B site, for example. There's a ton of things you can do there. You can flash people off like it's a train on inner, like lower inner B site. A ton of things that you can do in that respect. Just have to watch out for CTs being all sorts of places. This would probably be called Ninja or something. Somebody could certainly hide in here. I expect a lot of people to never check this, but of course you could just Molotov that off quite easily, since if they are hiding, you can just like throw this one pretty easily and suddenly they're fucked. So I guess the lineup, if that is smoked, would be coming to this area and then just aiming like... Oh, I guess this would probably be smoked as well, wouldn't it? But either way, it's probably an easy lineup to do. I guess you would just like aim down. No, I guess not. Well, we'll figure something out for the actual lineup section. But there's some things that you could do to get that Molotoved off. I would recommend, highly recommend, execing onto B with some sort of tempo. You want to be somewhat explosive, because the more map control you take towards the front of the B site, the more cover you can use, and the quicker you can adapt to any would-be positions that the CTs are trying to leverage. There's obviously a situation where you could double smoke this area to smoke off the back of B, and that would stop any CT rotates from coming in. But again, this is not something you want to do with 2 of your potentially 5 smokes on a gun round, especially. I think you don't want to have to use all of those smokes. Obviously, one benefit that this site has that the other sites don't is that because this window is propped open, you can get yourself into a pretty good position, throw your God flashes, and then as you're doing that, you are in a much better position in general to do this almost silently, especially if the smoke is still here. You get to do that and feel pretty good about it, I think. So that's just those are my 2 cents on the B-bomb site. I think that's how you would want to take the site. The other thing you could obviously do is try to isolate this map control and make the CTs sweat a little bit, because again, rotations are going to be very important on the CT side for this map. And maybe you take this with only 1 guy on B. You could, in theory, do this on the T side. And this is where, again, that mastery comes into play, right? So maybe your 1 guy B, comes into this angle, he throws his smoke, he gets set up for his flashes. That's obviously the wrong smoke. But he smokes his stuff off so he doesn't get opped or whatever. He throws his flashes. He gets his Molotovs lined up. And then after all that is taken care of, okay, the B pressure is in. Maybe people start to worry a little bit, right? So I guess that smoke's actually useful for smoking off the other one. Anyway, all of that stuff is quite helpful if you're trying to take B, or if you're trying to obviously put some pressure on the CTs. I think the main issue that this map is going to have is that if you're not familiar with all the ways you can be flanked, those are the ways that you are going to get flanked, odds are, right? It's almost like the game of timing where you look away after holding it for 20 seconds, and that's the point that he picks to peek you and destroy you. Well, that's kind of what I'm talking about with the flanks. The one flank you don't know about is the one that's going to be used, and that's the one you're going to remember anyway. That's the one that's going to absolutely destroy you. So bearing that in mind, it's something to just be on keep your head on a swivel on this map in general, especially on the T side. And you want to leverage that against your opponents if you can, but you also have a little bit of an advantage in that you can move as a unit against maybe 1 or 2 guys depending on where you're actually going. So again, I would say 2 to B, 1 to A, 1 to the server room, and 1 to mid would be the CT default. You could also swap that up and just have the 2-1-2 Classico setup if you wanted to play something like 1 bridge, 1 red, or 1 bridge, 1. I guess this would be like cooling or vent, or I don't. It wouldn't be vent. I don't know what this would be. Corner. Just call that one whatever you want to call it. So yeah, maybe you'd set up your A defense a little bit more to be a little bit less passive, and to rely a little bit less on people going mid, because obviously if the guy does get killed server room, then there's the pretty long rotate, the walk of shame back to CT spawn for the mid guy, and then obviously the people who are B. So you got to figure that out, and obviously this is something where almost using CT utility just to get map control, again, similar to how I sort of imagine Ancient would be running at a higher level. You don't want to throw that flash, obviously. You figure out a way to throw some flashes to take some control. Maybe you even find a smoke lineup for just smoking this middle section off, which wouldn't be perfect, I don't think. Oh, maybe that exact one would be, but I imagine it, yeah, it's not quite perfect. I imagine it's quite hard to get proper smoke for that, but you could at least get a smoke there. You could start to take some position. Maybe you just smoke off this angle, and then they've got a hard clear, a lot more cover. Something to that effect. You might find it even more impactful to do it vent side, so that you can fall back to the vent. If you, like, say you smoke this off, and then they don't know if you're maybe one-waying them over here, because you have a little bit of visibility there. They don't know maybe if you throw it even a little bit quicker, a little bit further over there to the left, you might even be able to really very, very easily one-way somebody. So that's an option as well. The vent doesn't really serve the Ts as well as it could, but I guess if you exec through mid, all 5 mid, you have a lot of advantages, actually, because you could decide, all right, let's just charge down CT spawn and go A or B. All right, let's send like 1 guy vent, 1 guy heaven, 2 guys through spawn, and then the last guy is the one who goes through the normal way, so to speak. And maybe that's how we take A. So there are things that you can do on Ts. I'm not saying it's hopeless by any means, but it certainly is a different look for a map than what I've experienced. I'm very excited to see maybe some of those Faceit map core games, if they end up getting uploaded anywhere, or I'm sure there's going to be plenty of like frag movies sections for that. If I had criticism for this map, and I certainly do, I would say that some of the map areas do feel a little, maybe too much in terms of how many rotations they add or how much sort of space they take up without offering too much, this connector in particular. Obviously, I understand why it's there because you want to connect those two parts of the map, but I feel like it's done in a very clumsy way. The interesting thing is the upper mid connector, or the upper mid anyway, in the terms of elevation, like that area. It's a very long, almost pointless corridor in theory, except it gives you a lot of lines of sight to mid, and again, mid is so important that I wouldn't be surprised that if you can just get yourself out here as a T, you can really have some favorable firefights and hopefully get yourself into a good position that way. I would also say, again, the glass, it's a bit much that there's so much glass everywhere that the Ts have to break, especially towards that A-bomb site where you have to break the glass in order to exec in a more conventional style. I guess you don't in theory if you want to exec through heaven, but the nade lineups there are a lot harder and a lot more scarce in general, so I wouldn't even suggest people doing that normally. So I guess, yeah, it's just a matter of whether or not you can play a successful default on this map for information, and then react to the CT setup. One of the things I like about this is that I believe it would be CT-sided, but not because it's actually CT-sided when teams are operating on more complete information. I would suggest it's like that because the Ts don't know what to expect when the CTs get aggressive. And when everybody expects each other to be as aggressive as they are, I actually think this could be a very interesting map where maybe you would see 8-7 halves, but it would have to be because of heads-up play. It would have to be because of high-quality play and deep strategies. So, yeah, certainly a map that I would put my stamp of approval on in terms of me being interested in it. Yeah, it certainly could have some things fixed about it, but it doesn't look bad. It's pretty minimalist in that sense, where it doesn't just distract you with a lot of eye candy. I guess maybe the actual bomb sites themselves are a little bit more like that, where there might be a little bit too much going on, but even they are not that bad, especially compared to a lot of the maps that are even currently in the map pool, for example, where there is a lot more going on. And of course, the tendency of community mappers to put a lot of stuff into their map, it's obviously something that takes effort, but is it really something that improves the map? I don't think so usually. So I'm quite happy that this map has got a little bit less going on in that respect and is a little bit more... It's minimalist without feeling repetitive too much. Like, I feel like I'm in a different spot of the map at pretty much all cases. Maybe not the atrium, so to speak, but for the most part, I feel quite happy with how the map visually sets its tone and gets its theme sort of extracted in that sense. So that will do it for my actual map analysis and walkthrough. You can check out the nades coming up very shortly, and thanks for taking a look at this video. As always, if you could drop a like, a comment, a sub, that would be very much appreciated on this channel. We are gunning for that 1,000 mark so I can start to make use of all of those epic features like very important polls, the likes of which you've never answered questions for before in quite the same way, I promise you. So we can get up to that mark without too much ado, then that would be epic. I'll see you guys very soon for another video, probably a little bit more esports focused, but I hope you enjoyed the map nonetheless. To take mid, you're going to pop these windows here, get yourself stuck up against the edge of this wall, aim in the middle of that flower pot towards its base, take one step, and then jump throw. That'll smoke off the top of mid from the CT POV. Pretty useful flashbang here. Stand in the same spot you threw that smoke. Aim to the bottom right of the flower pot. Take a running start and jump throw, just like you did the smoke. Should flash everybody who's top mid or even bottom mid looking out. Also behind this pillar. For a more complete exec out mid, throw the smoke first, then aim a Molotov to the right of the flower pot's top, just where it meets the little chair. Coupled with that flashbang, you'll Molotov anybody who's standing behind the smoke, which makes that little gap completely irrelevant. If you're planning on taking A, it's a good idea to pop these 3 windows from vent side. Once you've done that, you can walk right up against this crate, aim between those 2 dots as instructed, take out your molly, take one step and then throw normally, and that will Molotov anybody behind aircon. For a smoke deep red, you're going to line yourself up in the same spot you threw the Molotov, aim exactly on the rightmost lower dot, and give it a step throw. For a loosey-goosey flashbang onto sight, you're going to want to aim just below that dot where it meets the line. That should flash anybody playing on aircon, red room, pit, or even on top of some cover to the back of the site. To smoke off yellow for a teammate entering in from CT spawn, get yourself into this corner, aim where one line meets the other, give it a simple left-click throw. That'll go deep yellow, and anybody who wants to play from that angle will be forced out into the open to contend with whoever's lurking. If you find yourself in elo heaven, you can pop right up against this corner and line up your flashbang by aiming at the top of the pipe. A simple throw will flash anybody to the left of the site from the CT's POV. Taking B site is a bit of a different beast. You're going to use the rounded pillar dead ahead through B main. If you aim using the second leftmost line, you'll smoke off B main from CT connector. Aiming using the absolute leftmost line will let you smoke off B main completely free. With at least the B main smoke in play, you can pretty safely pop these windows. For some flashbangs out onto the site, line yourself up like so, aim right at the bottom of this little triangle, and give it a normal throw. Jumping on top of this little sandbag, you can aim like so, and give it a slight run throw. Both of these flashes combine to cover most angles that CTs will be holding from. Closing out with some B mollies, get yourself stuck into this position here at the edge of the wall, aim like so, and give it a slight run throw. You're going to want to practice this one a few times, but it should consistently Molotov out behind truck. This last Molotov will be on top of the sandbags as well. Aim like so, give it a run throw, that will Molotov off barrels.